he also said, remember, this is the first time you have this idea, equality before the law. 在法律之前，大家都平等。当然，大家是什么？大家是谁？ Male citizens, right? Doesn't include slaves, doesn't include women, but all the citizens are equal before the law. And he says, this is what makes our political community, our democracy, so distinctive. And he said, for public service, it's a kind of meritocracy, meaning that the posts are depend on ability, 跟能力，能力是最重要的，而不是贫困，没有不管是穷人还是钱人，都有平等的机会。Okay, for public service, it doesn't depend on money. It depends on ability. It's a kind of meritocracy. Also, he said, we are transparent. 我们是透明的制度。Okay, all our decisions, we all discuss it, even the bad ones, but everybody knows exactly what's going on. None of it is secret. It's all transparent. Still a virtue in many democratic societies. And he says, in private life, 我们不会干涉. A little bit similar to John Stuart Mill's idea that if people are a bit different, we won't interfere. He didn't quite say, so long as they don't harm others, but it's a very early idea of a kind of harm principle, that people should be free to do what they want, so long as they don't harm others. This is not great political theory. It's not systematic. It's a speech, a very short speech he gave to relatives, especially to mothers of those who died in war. But you have the germs of these ideas. And he said, we all have respect for laws, especially the laws that respect the weak, 保护弱者的法律. Those are so important for us. And that's one reason why we have a great community. And also, he said, we are very refined and cultures. 可以说我们的素质很高, and he's criticizing the opposite, meaning Sparta, the city-state of Sparta, where people are a bit more vulgar and materialistic. But he says, no, in Athens, we love beauty, we love philosophy, we love truth. 我们的素质都很高. And we have very strong civic virtue, 公民的美德. 我们都会关心公共善. We are concerned about the public good, not about our selfish private interests. So it's different than modern democracy, which is very individualistic. 我有自己的利益，所以我会我为那个统治者会投票. No, 他说我们都是 we all have a public spirit. 我们有公民的美德. Of course, so as this was only for men, right? It was 就是为了男人, and there wasn't the idea of rights was not yet invented. So that's one reason why he said we should be so patriotic. Now, why, if democracy had all these conditions, you had empire, you had a slave system, you had women doing the work, and you had men who are very patriotic, why did it decline eventually? It was successful in the sense that it lasted 300 or 400 years, but why did it decline? Well, there's a few reasons. The first, perhaps most important and immediate reason is that it was defeated in a major war. Athens was defeated in the Peloponnesian War. So later on, after the defeat, democracy was restored, but it was far less democratic, meaning fewer opportunities for ordinary citizens to participate in politics. There were more restrictions on the assembly. The economic and military power of Athens declined. Of course, that doesn't mean that the culture declined. In fact, It was a time of great philosophy. It's a bit similar to China. 中国战国时代 is the most beautiful time for philosophy, right? It's very similar here. Just when Athens was declining in political power, that's when you had the greatest philosophy. And the philosophers were very critical of the system because it was a time of decline. We'll look at that next week. And then later, democracy was almost completely suppressed by Philip of Macedon in 322 BCE. Property and military qualification were franchised. So before you had 40,000 citizens, now you just had 9,000. 现在当时只有9,000公民. And you needed to have property and you needed to serve in the military. The popular courts were less powerful and you no longer received as much money as before for participating in politics. So the conditions for democracy were gradually declined. But what was the deeper cause? Maybe there was an even deeper cause. And maybe the political community was hostile to the concentration of power in the hands of the few, and thus limiting the possibility of the concentration of power that could be achieved by monarchy. Sometimes, especially in times of war, it's similar in Chinese history, you need a very strong, centralized authority to achieve military success, right? 为什么秦始皇帝成功呢？主要是因为他用这些法家的方式，对不对？ Maybe it's similar here. In a time of war, it's very hard for a democratic community ruled by many, many people. It's very hard for them to win against an efficient monarchy. Whereas in later history, Rome and Venice had democratic characteristics, and they were more long-lasting. Venice, for example, it was a city-state in Italy, right? You all know the city-state of Venice. Now it's a city. Lasted 800 years or so as a kind of democratic political community, but it was less democratic than Athens, more oligarchical, and could do better in military context than Athens. So, we already looked at the ideals of democracy, but the real legacy of Athens is not the ideals, which were not, it was just a few lines here and there. It's really the institutions, okay? 是政治制度，他们的机构是什么? It's amazing that they invented so many of the political institutions of democracy that are still used today around the world and still inspire many political reformers in the world. And of course, the most important institution for a democracy is to have a political assembly, right? 公民大会. That was their invention too. Remember, direct democracy. 40 sessions a year, almost once a week. 差不多每个礼拜都要开会, okay? But you had to have a minimum of 6,000 people. 至少需要6000的公民才可以做决定, okay? So it's huge. 6,000 people all deciding on whether to go to war. Is Socrates guilty or not? We all vote. Everybody's vote counts for one, and the majority wins. But usually it was decided by consensus. Usually 是同意, it was consensus. 大家都要同意. 但是如果有冲突的话, then it's majority rule. 多数决定原则. All invented in this tiny little city-state, right? Of course, now it's more majority rule in assemblies, in the West anyway. Those that adopt, democratic systems that are similar to ancient Athens. And eventually also the democratic assembly, when democracy declined, there were more checks on the power of the assembly to protect law. And also members were paid, ordinary citizens were paid, maybe because to make it more democratic so that people would have an incentive to go, but maybe because it was less important, and that's why you need to pay people to go. Hard to know. The second important institution was the Bule, the executive grants. 人会议, 行政部门, hugely important because they had the task of preparing the business for the assembly. They would decide what the assembly voted on. 500 people would get together and argue, this week, what will the assembly decide? Should we go to war with Sparta or with another country? How do we distribute resources? When should we schedule the Olympics? All these questions were prepared for by this council of 500. And there were restrictions on this. The officials must be at least 30 years old. In those days, 30 is like 50 years old today, okay? 因为当时, 当时30岁主要跟现在50岁差不多. So you had to be quite old to participate in this. And the methods of selection, rotation, lot, 抽签, election, 选举, pay, were all meant to equalize chances of holding office. Every citizen should participate in this at least once in their life. Everybody should do it once in their life. Through these various means. And 也有反腐的制度, officials were accountable. After you finish your term in the council, they would go through your finances. 如果他们发现你腐败的话, 他们会惩罚你, So there was also a kind of system to prevent corruption in this Bule. And it was responsible for public finance and also for diplomacy. So very important institution. Also, People's Court, 民众法庭, very important. The juries who decided on criminal cases. This is more like if you committed a crime, you murdered somebody, then it would decided by ordinary citizens selected by lot. 也是用抽签的制度来选他们. Very powerful. They dominated in the 4th century when there were many lawsuits, impeachments, like now what you have in the US against Donald Trump, another invention in ancient Athens. There were political trials, there were strikes, down unconstitutional decrees, a bit like the US Constitutional Court, Supreme Court, which has the power to strike down laws by the Congress. They had a constitution. And the debates were often less demagogic, meaning more engaging with the issues than in the assembly. The juries all had to take an oath, like today, a kind of ritual. They must be over 30 years old, so like 50 years old today. And they were paid to do their job. So it was also a very powerful institution, a bit like the US Supreme Court, if you think of that today, okay? Or like China's Supreme Court, but more like the US Supreme Court, because they had the power to challenge the political decisions. And there were many local governments, 也有地方政府, okay? 明天有一个学者博老师他会讨论中国地方政府的一些情况. The idea of local governments also was invented in ancient Athens. Ancient Athens was a small city, but even within the small city, there were 139 subdivisions, each of which modeled. It's like a mini Athens. Their organization and deliberations upon that of the city, and also created strong bonds of solidarity. If we discuss, every class, we discuss the issues, for example, of Shanda, we're really going to be even more love of Shanda, right? Because we participate in the decisions. This is the basic idea, that if we participate actively in politics, we will have more of a public spirit, 公民美德, and that happens at the very local level. Finally, very important, you had kind of rituals, 也有一些礼，这些礼的作用也是为了提高社群感. It's to increase a sense of community and public spiritedness. You had banquets, you had hunting, you had markets. Gymnasium is more, well, it was a very special institution where the men, this is, the men would go to these, it was like you would go and take a bath, and often with younger citizens or younger males, and you would almost 有点像师生的关系，当然也有一些其他的一些其他的一些东西，其他的一些关系。But it was a way of the male citizens would establish very close, sometimes physical ties. It was homosexuality was very common, right? And 同性恋是很普通的制度 with younger males, and then they would make the younger males into strong and citizens who would be willing to also fight for their teacher and for the political community as a whole. So those who were anti-democratic, they closed these gymnasia, because they know that if you close the gymnasia, it would also be a way of cutting the bonds between the citizens. So all these activities, there's a very famous book by Plato called The Symposium. 我不知道你们读过没有？对，你们读过吗？ This was very common for philosophers, for ordinary citizens to get together, drink wine, and then talk about politics and sing. Also as a way of 有一点像就是我们已经讨论过的一些礼仪，就是像老板和员工一起唱歌，有一点像类似的情况。The whole point was to generate a sense of community and attachment to the community and generate a very strong sense of patriotism. So all these institutions work together to forge a very strong sense of patriotism among the male citizen members of Athens. And all these citizens, all these institutions are typical of democracies today. You have assemblies, you have administrative or executive branches, and you have courts. Remember, Montesquieu is a very famous French political thinker who said that you have three main branches of government, assembly, executive, and judicial. These are all here in ancient Athens. And you had others. You had local governments, very small governments that also generated a sense of patriotism. And you have rituals, ritual activities that also made people more patriotic and committed to the community. Now, 昨天我不知道你们，我好像我记得有一些学生他们听何宝刚老师，何宝刚老师很出名的原因也之一，因为 he went to a small little place in Zhejiang province, and he established a kind of it's called a democratic polling, democratic deliberation 应该非常学生是投票。What they selected citizens at random, very similar to ancient Athens, and then in a discussion with experts, they asked them to vote on issues. So 学生是投票 because you vote on issues, and then they make more informed judgments. And it was quite successful. 他们的决定是什么呢？就是怎么分配一些资源，这样类似的决定。然后通过这些制度，他们发现在中国也有一些，学生是投票，比较成功，但是到现在为止好像还没有推广。我昨天问他，他也说 我们的协商式投票跟西方不一样，我们受到一些儒家文化的影响，然后问他哪方面是受到儒家文化的影响，然后他说，第一，好像老百姓讨论的问题跟西方不一样，也有一些等级。第二，这些这些协商式的投票，在西方是为了限制政府的权利，但是在中国不一定，是为了给政府一些帮政府决定，对不对？是跟政府一起合作。然后第三个区别是什么？好像尊重老人，是尊重老人。反正中国的协商式投票，一方面受到古希腊的影响，另一方面也受到儒家文化的影响，所以我觉得很值得讨论。